Welcome to In Studio from Simply Timeless. I'm Jay Daniels. Several months ago, we were introduced to the sounds of trumpeter James Suggs. And while he's a native of central Pennsylvania, his musical journey has taken him around the world with stops in Ohio and Buenos Aires, Argentina. James now calls Saint Petersburg, Florida home. His debut project as a leader was produced in collaboration with saxophonist Houston Person. The name of that album is You're Gonna Hear From Me. This week we're going to hear from James as he shares the story of his life in music, beginning with his early years in school band in Susquehanna Township, Pennsylvania.
Fortunately, I had a great music program I was in Susquehanna County, Susquehanna Township in Pennsylvania, Harrisburg, and they had a great music program. So it was immediate. When I turned 9, I was given the choice of choosing an instrument for band or to sing in the choir. And I've always been scared of singing, so I chose the trumpet, which a friend of mine had already been playing. And then, immediately private lessons with great professional musicians. And then when I turned 10, I got to meet Wynton Marsalis. My mom and other friends took me to this concert, and just because I had been playing the trumpet for a year, they thought, he'll love it. And I remember, sitting there thinking, why am I here? This is so boring. Until Wynton stepped on stage, and then that changed my life. He was everything and more than I had imagined a professional musician could be. Just seeing the looks on people's faces and the reactions and the way he was dressed and the way he talked to the crowd and every note that he played, it was just magical. And so during the intermission, a friend, kind of pulled me along and said, you're going to go meet this guy. And so they kind of shoved me backstage, and Wynton gave me about 20-minute lesson on his break. And that was incredible. I mean, he sat down at the piano and said, you need to learn the piano and to work on your breathing. And he gave me his expensive Monet trumpet and said, play something for me, which I did, like a B-flat scale, I think. And he was just so gracious. And that was the turning point. Luckily it was that early in my life that I realized from then on that I wanted to pursue this.
Wynton, of course, comes from a very musical family. His dad, the great patriarch Ellis Marsalis, who recently passed. Were there any other members of your family who were musically inclined, or were you the only one?
Basically the only one. My dad played the trombone up until college, never professionally, but he's from Newport, Rhode Island, which, I mean, as soon as you say that name around jazz fans, their ears kind of perk up. And he would tell me stories of he and his cousin sneaking in to the Newport Jazz Fest. And, you gotta think this is in the late 50s probably. So everyone was there. Louis Armstrong, Miles Davis, Duke Ellington, Count Basie, Ella Fitzgerald. And they were just hearing that, down the road from where they lived, they were checking out all this amazing, amazing music. And so, yeah, he was a big inspiration as far as his collection of music. Anytime we went in the family van, there would be NPR or jazz or classical music playing. That's how I found out about Wynton in the first place, Wynton Marsalis, from listening to these cassette tapes in the van. But yeah, his record collection was incredible. He had just, stacks of incredible, historic, beautiful recordings that I still listen to today.
You mentioned two talented trumpeters in Louis Armstrong and Miles Davis. You obviously had the pleasure of meeting Wynton Marsalis when you were 12. Who were some of the other instrumentalists, including trumpeters, that you were taking in around that time?
It's funny because, there's moments, I have my cassette moments in my mind. I have the CD moments in my mind, So at that age, I was, anytime I get allowance money, I'd go to the local music store and get cassettes. So, of course, a lot of Louis, a lot of Wynton, and then Miles, Dizzy Gillespie. And then I would start, like my dad had my dad had a Jonah Jones album, which was, like no one talks about Jonah Jones still, unfortunately, but, he was an incredible trumpet player that I got to have this like all of a sudden experience listening to him that wasn't that common back then. So yeah, it was really specific. It's interesting how your upbringing and your environment kind of dictates what you listen to and what you like. It took me a while to really get into Dizzy Gillespie, but I had him in my mind just because I was able to listen to him at such an early age. But yeah, like most of my upbringing was just listening to like a lot of the classic trumpet players, and then I branch out to just anyone, Count Basie Band and Duke Ellington, and then Coltrane, which took a while to get used to, but then I ended up loving him.
When you were listening to those cassettes and those records, did you think, this is something I'd like to do as a job?
When I was talking about the Winton experience, meeting him, that night I went home and I wrote a letter to him, which I don't know if he ever got or never, received a response, but that didn't matter. It was just kind of my kind of self-affirmation saying, I'm going to commit myself to this. And that was basically what the letter said. It said, thank you so much. You basically changed my life and I want to pursue this. This was at 10 years old. So I didn't really know what I was talking about. I didn't think about, like all the hardships and, being on the road and paying bills and getting gigs canceled and all that stuff. But what I was thinking about was all the, the beautiful things that we kind of have to keep in mind at those troubled times to, focus on the good things. And the reason why we kind of gotten into it in the first place, which is, that mystique, that beauty, that magic that we love and that sparked that interest in the first place. So from that point on, I wanted to be a professional musician. I didn't know how, I didn't know what the next step was. My parents said, all right, you got to go study with this guy and this guy and this guy and go to this jazz camp. And I did it, but no one gave me kind of an instructional pamphlet to follow that course.
After school, you continued to hone in on your craft, and that led to a number of performance opportunities with some really great arrangers and band leaders. There were two opportunities I really wanted to talk about. You and I share a great love of big band music, and I remember when I was first being introduced to jazz, some of the early recordings were from, say, Guy Lombardo, Benny Goodman, the classic swing era big bands. But there are two whose legacies continue even today in 2020, the Glenn Miller and the Tommy Dorsey orchestras. Tell us about some of the things you learned from those experiences.
I went to Youngstown State University in Ohio. That's where I did my undergrad degree in jazz performance. And I still don't really know why, but there's a big connection and has been for a while between that university and those two bands, those two orchestras, Glenn Miller and Tommy Dorsey. For instance, you'd go to, big band practice at Youngstown State and you'd hear the second trombone player say, yeah, I just auditioned for Glenn Miller. I'm going out, in the summer. So, it started to pique my interest. And then finally, a trumpet player asked, hey, are you interested? There's the jazz chair is opening up. So that's when I did that. And it's funny, like being a snot-nosed brat at that time, I thought, this is nothing. Glenn Miller is easy music. I'll just, walk in and it won't be an issue and I won't be stressed at all or challenged at all.
And that's exactly what happened, right?
Exactly. And, so yeah, the first gig we were playing on stage and I'm sight reading everything and I'm feeling pretty confident. And the lead player, Ashley Hall, who's been on the band for, I don't even know, maybe 25 years. After the gig, he leans over to me and says, good job, and he started listing all the times that I messed up. And he gave me examples. You play this note too long. You play this note too short. You put vibrato on this note. You should, all these things that I said. I was thinking, who cares? I read the book, and I later soon found out that was the magic of such an incredible band. That's their legacy is that the way they play together, the way they make magic happen together. It sounds like one instrument, And that's when my ears started to really open up and hear the beauty of these bands. And we later in that tour, we ended up recording an album called Steppin' Out. And we recorded at, I think, XM station. And by the time, that was a few months in, by the time we got to the recording session, I had felt more comfortable with those cutoffs, playing the notes exactly the way the other guys had played it, and those were things I was really working on that they don't really teach in a lot of places. So that was a great educational moment in my life. And then later with Tommy Dorsey, it was the same kind of thing. Friends from Youngstown State said, hey, we're looking for a trumpet player for a cruise. So we did a 10-day cruise, and that was under the direction of Buddy Morrow, the great Buddy Morrow, who was just, magical. That was a few years before he passed. So he wasn't playing much, but it was just so great to hang out with him and get all of his stories. And it was a great experience.
And your time on the road, it did not come to an end by any means. In the coming years, you would actually leave the States to go south for a while. And when I say south, I mean, as a friend of mine from Venezuela calls it, the deep south. You spent several years in Argentina. What led to that decision, James?
I started working around the same time when I was doing these big bands. I started working on cruise ships. The first, I did 6 contracts altogether. The first contract was in a jazz group, and then there were a few orchestra gigs, which is pretty much the group that plays in the big theater for all the shows, the singers and dancers and all that. And then a few more jazz combo gigs. So during that time, I met some good friends from Argentina, from Buenos Aires, that, we'd play the gig and then we'd hang out and talk, and they'd say, you got to come to Buenos Aires. You'd love it. And first night I'd say, okay, great. And then that, for 6 months, hearing that, I finally gave in. I said, okay, I'll do it. And then I eventually went down there, and it was a beautiful experience. I stayed for 8 years. And I came back with a wife.
I was going to ask, when did she come along?
Well, she the last year that I was there, I met her and we were dating. But by the time that had happened, I had already started thinking about, getting back to the States. I was missing my family. I was missing, the English language. Just all the random things that you don't think about that you would miss being away from your home country. I started missing. And I felt like, I needed to pursue higher education or other things in my career, which eventually happened. So I made that decision pretty much starting at that time where I met my then girlfriend. So, we broke each other's hearts, and I left and came back to the States, and we couldn't stay away from each other. We kept calling each other and checking in, and she visited me, and I'd go back and visit her. And then that was it, So we've been married for about a little over 2 years. She came and visited right before we got married, and that's it.
You always have to watch out for Cupid. You never know when he might strike,
That's true. Very true.
So since then, you have gotten your master's from the University of South Florida. And also in that time, you have released your first album as a leader. I mean, you've played on several recordings. The name of the album is You're Gonna Hear From Me, and it features yourself on trumpet. Also, what I would call heavy hitters in the world of jazz. There's Houston Person on tenor sax. There's Lafayette Harris on the piano, bassist Peter Washington, and drummer Lewis Nash. And for those who are dyed-in-the-wool jazz fans, and maybe even those who haven't been around that long, those names obviously carry a bit of weight with them. How is it that you were able to bring such a team together for that project?
It all started with Rachel Dahmer, who is the head, the CEO at Arbors Records here in Clearwater, Florida. And honestly, in my ignorance, I I'd moved to Saint Pete, Florida, 6 years ago. So at that time, I had never heard of her or Arbor's Records. But I was playing a show with Nate Najar, the great guitarist, local guitarist, at the Palladium Theater in St. Pete. And Rachel came up to me after the show backstage and said, "I want to record you." And I didn't know who she was. And, she gave me a card and I said, "Hey, that sounds fine." Okay. I didn't, pass it off as anything small, but I said, "Okay, I'll think about this." And then later talking to the guys, I think Chuck Red was there as well. And they said, "No, you should, really, call her back. And she's a great person and could give you a great experience, a great opportunity." So thanks to them, I pursued it, and that's where it all began. And she is such a giving and welcoming person. And so she pretty much said, "You do what you want to do." So she said, "You get who you want to get." And I thought, I need to get the best musicians I can think of. And also Nate Najar was the one who suggested I should get a veteran musician that I respect and love, just to kind of be at the helm. And so Houston Person's name came up, and I'm so thankful that that's the way it happened, because I had all these other guys in my mind that I love and equally and have listened to all my life, but Houston really put together a band that worked so well, not only in the studio but outside the studio, not only in the practice session but after the fact. We still keep in touch. And I mean, they're great guys, and they wanted to do they weren't showing up to a gig. That's what it felt like. It felt like they were really just like trying to make some music happen, and I feel like that's the way it happened. To answer your question, Houston ended up choosing those musicians with my final approval. But yeah, how could I say no to all those great heavy hitters, as you said?
I was getting ready to say, if you said no, we were going to have a talk. You and Houston worked specifically on the songs that were included on the album, and you had a couple back and forth as far as what you should include, how they should be presented. So what was the idea for the songs that you included on the album?
It was great because going back to, I grew up listening to those Wynton Marsalis albums that, the Standard Time Volume 1, 2, and 3, where he's going back to playing standards and some of them aren't that well known or weren't at that time, or he arranged them differently than we're used to. So I love that idea and that sound, that classic sound. No frills, just like good standard jazz. Fortunately, Houston was completely on board with that, and we were thinking along the same lines. So it began as sending emails back and forth saying, "All right, how about this tune?" And he'd say, "No, everyone plays that tune." And then he'd send me a tune I'd never heard of, and I have to go and research it. He'd send me a lead sheet. It's funny, he'd go to FedEx and FedEx me a lead sheet to my email. So and it's funny, it was this back and forth thing where until like the day before the recording session, we were in New Jersey at the hotel, and he had the adjacent room to me, and he called me and he said, "Come on over." And this was the night before, so obviously I'm freaked out, I'm nervous, I'm thinking about the tunes that we already talked about. And he has this huge stack of lead sheets of other tunes that he wants me to check out. So he's going through them one by one and saying, "What about this tune? Have you heard this one?" And I'm saying yes to all of them because it's Houston Person and he knows what he's talking about, of course.
What did you and Houston have in mind as far as bringing this ensemble together?
It was another example of how ideal that pairing was with Houston. We both immediately had respect for each other. He didn't know where I was coming from until I kind of let him know. And then once I let him know that we were pretty much on the same page, he kind of relaxed and we had fun. There were moments when we go out, to Starbucks together, and just like, I remember, just dying laughing about stories he was telling. I mean, we ended up being great friends from that experience, and we still talk to each other, and he'll call occasionally. He became a great mentor, and that's what it was. From the beginning, we rehearsed the day before, we recorded, and then we did the mixing the following day, and that was it. But each moment along the way, he'd say, give me some advice. Never condescending, never pointing his finger, shaking his head. He'd always just ask me, what about this idea? What about this? Even, like talking about tune lists, we were in the studio, and there was one tune that we were going to play. It's kind of a funky tune called Pretty Please that he recorded in '78. It's an awesome tune. And I transcribed all of it. I was ready to have everyone play it. And he said last minute in the studio, he said, man, I don't think this is for this record. Let's leave it for the next album. And I was kind of disappointed at first, but then immediately I realized, yeah, he's right. He knows what he's doing. He's done this for so many years. And he would tell me, people just want to hear nice music and a nice album, and he's made a career of doing that since he started, which was many, many years ago. So fortunately, I learned how to kind of keep my mouth shut and say, yes, sir, okay, whatever you say, I'll do. And that trust really was extremely valuable in the long run.
So you're saying that you and Houston could very well work together on a second album then?
Yes, and that's like I was saying. Like we'll talk occasionally. Every time we talk, he mentions the second album, and we and I say, of course, I would love to. And he tells me, like even if he's not playing on it, he wants to produce it. He wants to be a part of it. And I'm thinking, how can I not have him play on it? Like he's amazing. So yeah, we definitely want to do another collaboration together.
And just as he has taught you so much through your work together, you also are an educator, a teacher to a number of students there at USF. Through your work with these artists that you mentioned, through the orchestras, through your Latin jazz experiences in the South, and also with Houston Person as of more recent times, through those experiences, what have you also been able to teach your students in the classroom?
I always struggle with what to do in the classroom. Do I pull out the books and say, practice page 3 through 36, or do I go on experiences that I've experienced in my life? And that's usually what it kind of ends up being a mix. But because I've done so many things and kind of moved around a lot, I kind of feed off of those things, take from those experiences. I always appreciated that when I used to study with Max Colley III, who's a trumpet player now in Michigan. And, he's I think I was 13 when I studied with him. And, he was friends with Wynton and John Faddis and everyone basically. And he'd give me these stories to back up why I should practice what I'm practicing. He'd say, well, John Faddis would do this, and now he's John Faddis. And I'd say, okay, that's all I need to hear. I'll work on it, And those things, those kind of stories, anecdotes kind of helped me, because it's hard to know where to start as a student. So I try to portray that. I try to give that back to my students and say, okay, well, I remember when I was on tour with Glenn Miller, and I kept messing this up. So I started to work on this, and then that puts it into perspective. And I think it starts being an actual thing that we can go after rather than just something that we're reading from page to page. I have a couple of private jazz trumpet students. I take them at whatever level they're at, and however they, each aspiring young jazz trumpet player wants to sound like so-and-so. So I try to look for that line from them to so-and-so and connect that line the best I can. And then also I'm running the second jazz ensemble, the big band, as well as a jazz combo. So yeah, that also with those ensembles, I try to incorporate what I've learned or what I am learning. If I go and play a gig, with my group, and then coming the next day to teach jazz combo, I'm going to relay some of the things that went well and didn't go well, just to kind of give them some perspective into how they should be practicing and what they should be looking for.
What have you been able to learn from this music? What has this music taught you about life?
It's taught me everything. It's funny, I was telling my wife a while ago, the principal used to call home occasionally. My teachers used to complain about me because I was unruly and, act up in class. And she couldn't believe it because now I'm more relaxed and, I'm not quick to open my mouth. And I think that was one of the first things that music taught me, not even jazz or just being in a band, being in a group of people like that, and having a conductor or a teacher telling you what to do and when to do it. And I think I needed that structure, and musically it was the best way to get that structure. I pretended like I was an athlete for a couple of years and then quickly gave that up, or it gave me up pretty much. And, that wasn't the way that I could have been taught how to compose myself and to play well with others, basically. I think the musical version of that helped out a lot. Because as playing in a band, if you get it, if you're quick to talk or to complain or to whatever, it's not going to work out. So I think that taught me a lot, and also patience and acceptance of others and situations. That we've all been in those situations where it's not the most ideal musically, but we have to figure out how we're going to make it the most fun.
Trumpeter James Suggs, our guest this week during In Studio from Simply Timeless. The name of the album is You're Gonna Hear From Me, and it's available through your preferred music platform. Thanks to James for taking the time to speak with us. And thanks to you for listening. Until next time, I'm Jay Daniels, thanking you for joining us in studio.